The night they came for Maren Voss, the rain had already ruined her herb bundles, and she was in no mood for visitors. She heard the horse before she saw the lantern, hooves on the muddy track behind the cottage, too fast for comfort, too deliberate to be lost. She set down her mortar and dried her hands on her apron. A rider arriving at that hour, at that pace, could only mean one thing. The man at the door was soaked through. Young livery she didn't recognise, eyes showing too much white. He said the Earl of Ashgrove was dying. Maren almost told him she was an apothecary's widow, not a physician. She almost said he needed a doctor from Harwick, someone with a proper bag and a proper title. She almost shut the door and went back to her pestle. Almost. "How far?" she said instead, and reached for her coat. The village of Crest Hollow sat at the edge of what most county maps simply called the moors, as though naming the particular stretch of nothing would grant it too much importance. Maren had lived there for 4 years, since the death of her husband, Geoffrey, whose apothecary shop in Harwick she had quietly run for the last 2 of their 6 years together, though the sign above the door had always said his name. When Geoffrey died of a fever that she had not caught early enough, she had taken his ledgers, his reference texts, and his mortar set, and moved somewhere nobody would ask her about the sign. She had a reputation in Crest Hollow, not a comfortable one. Women who knew too much about plants and pain were rarely comfortable to have around, but a useful one. Mothers came to her. Farmers with infected limbs came to her. Old men who couldn't sleep, and young men who'd gotten into fights. She charged what people could pay, and she did not gossip. That was enough. She had never been summoned to Ashgrove Hall. The estate sat 2 miles east of the village, behind an avenue of beeches that were dramatic in summer and mournful in every other season. In the rain at just past midnight, with a young groom named Alfie riding slightly too fast ahead of her borrowed horse, the avenue felt less like an approach and more like a throat. The house was lit on the 2nd floor. A woman waited in the doorway, severe face, housekeeper's ring of keys, not a person who had been asleep. She looked at Maren the way people often looked at her, with the particular calculation of someone who needed help they considered themselves too dignified to need. "Mrs. Voss," the woman said. "Not a question." "I am Mrs. Dunn. The house steward, Mr. Hartley, asked that you be sent for. The household physician is in Edinburgh and cannot return before Thursday." "What are the symptoms?" Maren said, already stepping inside. "Vomiting, severe cramping of the stomach. A fever that came on quickly and is now—" Mrs. Dunn paused. "Worsening, when did it start?" "After supper, 6 hours ago." Maren followed her up the stairs. The house was the kind of quiet that presses down. Most large houses at night had a background hum to them. Fires banking, servants passing, the particular creak of old wood. Ashgrove had all of those things, but they were muffled, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The Earl's chamber was at the end of the east corridor. Mrs. Dunn knocked once, opened the door, and stepped back to let Maren through. She had expected someone old. She didn't know why. Earl's dying in the night felt like an old man's thing. But the man in the bed was perhaps 35, perhaps a few years more, with dark hair matted against his forehead, and a face that, even hollowed with illness, was the kind of face people probably found difficult to ignore. He was awake, which was something. He was watching the door with grey eyes that were sharp despite everything. "You are not Dr. Mallow," he said. His voice was rougher than she imagined it would be. "No," she said. "I'm Maren Voss. I'm what you have tonight." He looked at her for a moment. Then, with what she suspected, cost him considerably. "Then, I suppose you'd better come in." His name, she had been told, was Adrian Croft, Earl of Ashgrove, and he had been at the Hall for only 3 weeks, having returned from nearly 2 years of business in Halifax. He had no wife. His closest family was a younger sister, Lady Isolde, who had been mistress of the house in his absence, and who was now, Maren gathered, somewhere in the corridor outside, trying not to make her presence known. Maren spent the first hour assessing. She checked his pulse, rapid and thin, which she didn't like. She checked his eyes. She asked him what he had eaten at supper, and he told her, patiently, each course, each drink, in a methodical way that suggested he had already been conducting his own mental inventory. He was frightened, she realized, but he was frightened the way people frightened themselves by reason, not by panic. He had worked out that what was happening to him was not ordinary illness. He simply hadn't said it out loud yet. "Has anyone else in the household taken ill?" she asked. "Not as of the last report," said Mrs. Dunn from the doorway. "Did the Earl eat the same supper as the rest of the house?" A pause. "Mostly. His lordship's portions were prepared separately. He prefers plain food after travelling. Mrs. Hartley in the kitchen keeps to that." Maren kept her face neutral. "I see." She stayed through the night. She gave him willow bark for the fever, made him drink water steadily, in small amounts, and sat with him through the worst of the cramps in the early morning hours while rain blurred the windows to grey gauze. He didn't complain. He gritted his teeth and looked at the ceiling and once said very quietly, "This is deeply undignified," and she said yes, and he almost laughed. By 4 in the morning he was slightly better. Not well, not close, but the improvement was there, a degree less fever, a little more colour. She sat in the chair by the fire and opened the small notebook she always carried, and began to write down everything he had told her about supper. The meat course served to the Earl separately. The wine from a decanter in his private study, poured by someone before he came down. The tincture he took each evening for a mild chronic cough, prepared by his valet and left on his nightstand. She looked at that last entry for a long time. Geoffrey had taught her about poisoning without ever intending to. He'd meant to teach her about medicine, about the correct doses of things, about the narrow margin between cure and catastrophe. But in learning the right amounts, she had also learned about the wrong ones. She knew what cumulative poisoning looked like. She knew how it could be disguised as illness. She knew the particular signature of certain compounds that left the body fighting itself from the inside. What she was looking at, she was almost sure, was not a fever from food gone bad. She did not say this to anyone. Not yet. She returned to the hall the following afternoon, having gone home only long enough to sleep 3 hours and collect certain preparations she didn't keep in her bag. Lady Isolde was waiting in the entrance hall, younger than her brother by perhaps 6 or 7 years, pretty in the angular way that ran in some families, with the same grey eyes and a composure that Maren suspected had been acquired rather than inherited. "He is resting," Isolde said. "The fever broke this morning. I know. I sent word with Alfie about the preparations I left." "Yes," a pause. "He asked for you specifically. He asked that you return." Maren looked at her. "And does that trouble you, my lady?" It was a direct question, possibly too direct. But Maren had learned that direct questions in large houses often yielded more than the indirect kind, because people weren't prepared for them. Isolde didn't flush or deflect. She looked at Maren steadily and said, "I don't know you well enough for it to trouble me one way or the other. But I would ask, do you believe he is improving because of ordinary illness resolving, or because of something you've given him?" Smart, Maren thought. "I believe," she said carefully, "that what your brother had was not ordinary illness. I believe that whatever caused it has been reduced, for now, by what I've given him, and I believe that understanding how it was reduced will tell us more about what caused it." Isolde held her gaze. "Come upstairs," she said. "He'll want to hear this himself." Adrian Croft was sitting up when Maren entered, which was already a significant improvement over the man who had been clenched over his own stomach 12 hours before. He looked exhausted in the specific way that serious illness leaves behind, the deep under the eyes kind, the hollowness, but his attention was immediate and complete. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "my lord." She settled into the chair and set her bag down. "I need to ask you some questions that may seem unusual." "After last night," he said, "I am prepared to find very little unusual." She asked him about the tincture, who prepared it, who had access to his valet's supplies, whether there had been any other incidents in the weeks since his return. Minor ones. Things he might have attributed to travel fatigue or the damp of the moors. He answered each question with the same careful attention he had given to the supper menu, and as he answered, she watched his face change, slowly the way faces change when people begin to understand something they had not wanted to understand. "You think I was poisoned," he said finally, not a question. "I think," she said, "that there is a compound in the tincture that does not belong there, and I think it was not a large amount. But I also think, given what you have described about small illnesses in the past 3 weeks, that it has been administered more than once." The silence in the room was absolute. "Who?" he said. would have access to the valet's supply room. That is what I'd like to understand. It could not be done quietly. That was the difficulty with a large household. Nothing in it existed in isolation. The valet, a mild-mannered man named Prentice, was genuinely appalled, and Maren believed him, because genuine appalment was difficult to counterfeit, and Prentice was not a complex man. He showed her the supply room, the small cabinet of preparations, the locked box where he kept the compounds Geoffrey's reference books would have called medicinal but careful. The lock, when she examined it, had been forced and reset. Done well. Done by someone who knew what they were looking for. She asked quietly, who else had a key to that corridor? Mrs. Dunn. Mr. Hartley, the house steward, Lady Isolde, and a cousin of the Earl's, one Roland Vane, who had been visiting the estate since before Adrian's return and who was, according to everyone Maren spoke to in carefully indirect ways, hoping to remain. She did not say Roland Vane's name to Adrian. Not yet. She needed to be certain. Roland Vane was 28, fair-haired, with an open face and the easy manner of someone who had been the most charming person in every room he had ever entered. He was unfailingly courteous to Maren in the way that certain men were courteous to women they did not consider relevant, a smooth, reflexive courtesy that cost nothing and meant less. When she passed him in the corridor on her second day at the hall, he asked after Adrian with apparent warmth and said he hoped Mrs. Voss would be able to restore his cousin quickly. "We're all very worried," he said. His eyes were steady and soft, the face of someone with nothing to hide. She had seen that face before. Geoffrey had a client once, a farmer who'd come in twice for treatment for a lung ailment, and Geoffrey had said afterward that the man's lungs were fine and he could not account for the symptoms, and she had looked at the man's wife beside him and understood. The wife had the same soft eyes. She went back to Adrian that evening. "Tell me about Roland," she said. It came out slowly and then quickly, the way things did when someone had been pressing them down. Adrian and Roland had grown up together. Roland's father, a wastrel younger brother of Adrian's father, had died early and the estate had taken Roland in. Adrian had gone to school to Halifax, to the building of a trading concern that was now considerably more profitable than the Ashgrove estate itself. Roland had stayed, had managed things with Mr. Hartley's assistance in the years of Adrian's long absences. "He manages the household accounts," Adrian said. "Does he have access to everything?" Adrian's voice was flat. "I trusted him with everything. And if you were to die," Maren said, as gently as she could manage, which was not very gently, "what would happen to the estate?" The pause was long. "Roland is not the heir, but he holds a debt against the estate that—" Adrian stopped. "That would allow him to claim significant assets. If I died without issue, without a will revised since I updated my affairs in Halifax." He looked at the ceiling. "Which I have not yet done." "Does Roland know about the Halifax revisions?" "I intended to discuss them with Mr. Hartley this week." She watched his face as he understood it. The timing, the 3 weeks. The slow accumulation of compound in the tincture he took every night without a second thought. Because Prentice had always prepared it, and Prentice was trustworthy, and there was no reason to think. "He has been in this house since before I returned," Adrian said. "Yes, he knew what I would return to. He knew what I would change. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He sat with me last night when I was at my worst. He sat in that chair and he held my hand and he told me—" He stopped. "What did he tell you?" "He told me everything would be all right." Maren said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. She went to Mr. Hartley the following morning. The house steward was a careful, small man who had served the Croft family for 22 years and who received what she told him with a stillness that she respected. "You have evidence," he said. "It was not a question. I have the compound. I have the lot. I have a pattern of illness that began precisely when Mr. Vane had opportunity and reason." She paused. "I also believe, and this I cannot prove, only observe, that Mr. Vane has been ensuring that Mr. Prentice did not look too closely at his own supply cabinet. Small things, keeping him occupied, suggesting the key be left in a particular place for convenience." Hartley looked at his desk for a long time. She understood what he was weighing. 22 years. A man he had worked alongside, depended on, perhaps considered a kind of family to the family. The particular grief of finding that someone had used the fabric of ordinary trust to do something unconscionable. "What does his lordship wish?" he said. His lordship, she said, is prepared to have this handled correctly. All of it. Hartley looked up. Including, she said, any assistance that was given, however indirectly, by anyone who allowed access to that corridor to continue unchallenged. There was a silence. Then Hartley said quietly, "I did not know. I believe you," Maren said. "But I also believe that you noticed something, and that you chose not to look at it too closely." He was silent for a very long time. "Yes," he said at last, "yes. I suppose I did." "That will need to be part of what's addressed," she said. "Not because I think you meant harm, but because the Earl deserves a household where the people around him are honest about what they see." She said it without cruelty. He received it without defence. It was one of the better conversations she had ever had in a house like this. A magistrate was sent for. Roland Vane, when confronted in the library by his cousin and a man with a document, did something that Maren had half expected. He tried charm first. He tried bewilderment. He tried a particular version of wounded pride. How could you think this of me, after everything that she imagined had served him very well in every previous crisis of his life? It did not serve him here. The compound was identified by name in Maren's written report. The forced lock was examined by two people who confirmed the marks. Prentice testified to the pattern of small displacements in his supply cabinet over 3 weeks. And Hartley, to his considerable credit, made a full and written account of the access he had permitted Roland to the east corridor out of long habit and misplaced trust, and offered it without being asked. Roland's charm collapsed in stages. First to insistence, then to accusation. Maren was fabricating. Maren had motives. Maren was a village woman with no standing to make such claims, and then, at last, to silence. The kind of silence that meant there was nothing left to say. He was removed from Ashgrove Hall that afternoon. The legal proceedings that followed were, Maren understood later, both thorough and appropriately severe. She was not present for most of them. She had patients in Crest Hollow who needed her. She was packing her bag in the entrance hall when Adrian came down. He was moving carefully. 5 days of serious illness left its mark, but he was dressed, upright, and his eyes were clear in a way they had not been when she arrived. "You're leaving without saying goodbye," he said. "I said goodbye to Mrs. Dunn." "That is not," he said, "the same thing." She looked at him, in the grey morning light of the entrance hall, with the rain finally stopped, and the beaches dripping outside the long windows. He looked more like himself than she could have guessed, from the man she had first met in that darkened bedroom. Something resolved, she thought. Something that had been braced for weeks had finally been allowed to rest. "You'll want to have the physician look at you when he returns from Edinburgh," she said. "The effects should clear entirely within a fortnight, but he should confirm." "I will," he paused. "I have asked Mr. Hartley to add something to his accounting. For your services, the usual rate is—" "What I am proposing," he said, "is considerably above the usual rate. I am aware that is uncomfortable for you. I am also aware that you are too sensible to refuse it on principle." She almost smiled. "You've known me 4 days, Maren," he said, and her name in his mouth without title or prefix was so unexpected that she stopped entirely. "I was dying, and you were the only person in this house who looked at what was in front of you and told the truth about it. That is, not a small thing, in my experience." She thought of Geoffrey, of the years behind his sign, of moving to a village where nobody asked, of the mortar set she still used every day because it was a good one and because she had earned the right to it. "No," she said, "I suppose it isn't." She picked up her bag. She did not say that she would come back. She did not need to. He did not say it either, which suggested that he already knew she would, when she had reason, and that he was already quietly making sure there would be one. She walked down the avenue of beeches in the thin October light, her boots wet from the grass, her bag heavier with what she had been given, and she thought about the last 4 days with the particular attention she gave to cases that had taught her something. She had come here knowing about poisons. She had left knowing about what made people capable of them. Not evil, exactly, not the storybook kind, but want and proximity and the slow erosion of conscience that happened when someone stood too long beside a thing they believed should be theirs. She had also, she noted, learned that some earls were better patients than others. She would add that to the ledger too.